So on this video, I'm going to show how I detailed one of the 5 Spitfires that I made, how I did the cockpit. Maybe give you some ideas if you're doing a semi-scale model or even a traditional stunt model. These ideas have worked for me on many models, many concourse winners, of course, and they're relatively easy to do, and it may give you some good ideas. It's a lengthy video, but I think there's really good information on here if you're serious. Now, one thing is very helpful, and it was very helpful to me in making the Spitfires. I had a lot of documentation, quite a few books that I had bought. Joe Adamusco and I both shared a lot of material. We had many pictures of what a real Spitfire looked like. And when I was in England, the 2 times I was in England, I got to see and take photos of many Spitfire cockpits. And I got to see the Spitfire in Houston, and from all the documentation, all the pictures I tried to boil it down and make it into a semi-scale. Remember, this is not a scale model, but I want to give the illusion that when you look inside that cockpit, that it's a real airplane, a real Spitfire. Okay, the last time we worked on this, and keep in mind we're doing a lot of things at once in the shop here, a lot of molding projects. I'm trying to segregate them out into meaningful videos. But one of the things that was extremely important before we start the canopy mold, the detailing, see, I'm thinking mold, not detailing, is I want to make sure, again, a final time, that I have the fit that I want around the radius, around the back, that it's lined up the way I want it. And once that's done, and it looks like we did accomplish that the last time we worked on this, we can put the plexiglass away. And the next step of this is going to be to try to lay out exactly where we want to make the bulkhead for the back. And we need to reference off the first thing, and what I'll do is I'll work from the back to the front. I need to reference where this bulkhead will be. And what I'll do, I'll use this piece as just to rough it out, make it a little oversized. Cut this piece, and then I'll have this little section completely enclosed. Now this will reference me for this part. Now a good way to do this is, we know the groove is parallel. We can feel it with a piece of 1/8 inch tape. And I want to add a little piece of 1/8 inch tape just for my own, like a little safety margin. So I have a little bit of material extra. So I can always cut it back. It's a lot easier to cut it back than to add material. And this will give me a little rough layout where I want this piece to end. Again, it's always easier to lay this out with tape before you actually commit to a cut. See, now with the tape on, what it allows me to do is move these lines, see if they're parallel, if they're crooked in any dimension, and I can just adjust these until I'm real happy before I make my cut. And I'll even leave a little extra material. Now, because this is already covered with fiberglass, I want to use a brand new XL blade and get one real nice cut on this. I want to leave a little bit of a rib there, a little bit of a support. Keep in mind this whole fuselage is fiberglass, so you would think we'll have some integrity there anyway. Okay, now we've got a box to work in. What I need to do now, I need to measure this dimension forward to the bulkhead and this dimension across, and make up the little plate that'll be the bottom plate for this the back radio compartment. Now, this is certainly one area where using an XL cutting pad and brand new blades will make for a lot nicer, neater operation. Now, in essence, once this is trimmed, this is going to be the back radio compartment shelf. That's tack glued in. I can trim the edges nice. One of those great little spots, a Bud McKnight sanding stick a la nail file seems to work. And once this edge is totally blended in, now because this is an edge I'm going to see once the canopy is on here, I want to harden it up with CA once I have the shape right, and that will be a finish edge. Now, one good way to do this to avoid making a mess is just put the good old-fashioned CA on a Q-tip. It'll actually give a better tooth to the epoxy too when we epoxy the canopy on permanently. Now we have that edge finalized, I hope. Notice that word, hope. Once this kicks off, now what I want to do as I go, every step of the way, is refit the canopy. Make sure we have the fit that we want, because if we don't want to put any detailing in there. Once those edges are all sanded in, you notice that they're hardened up with the thin CA. I want to make a bulkhead, a complete bulkhead for the back of this. This is acting as a fuselage former. That shell has no formers in it, and this will really make that back end of the fuselage hopefully nice and rigid. Remember that word, hopefully. I make that piece out of 64th plywood, but I want the grain to be going side to side. So you can see one side of this is flexible. I want the strength in this dimension. So I'll lay it out with the grains going side to side. And there's a relatively easy way to make a good template on this. And just trace this from the back and sand the line off when I make the cut. And that gives me the back bulkhead shape. I can just take a look and make sure I have the fit I want. Okay, I got all these surfaces sealed up with 2 coats of thin Brodax CA. Trying to get a reasonably nice finish on them. The reason being I don't want to see the wood grain in the final finish. So it's easier right now to sand this than before I put the next bulkhead in. Obviously, if that bulkhead is here, it's hard to put a finish on this. So you want to kind of always think ahead. What can you pre-finish before it's installed? Now when I make this bulkhead that's going to actually seal this area up, I can only go down, because of the push rod being here, maybe an inch and 1/10 maybe, before I run into interference. And then I have a piece that's an exact copy of this, so what I need to do is take this piece and add an inch to it. So what I'm trying to do is just do a little interpolation here. These are the rough angles. Best to make the piece a little bit oversized. And I know I can come down roughly an inch. But again, there'll be no substitute for just making it oversized and going back and forth a few times. And probably making up about 20 pieces before I'm done. Doing a trial fit on any of these kind of parts, what I can do is I've made a little notation. I need to add a little bit of material here and lower that notch just a little bit. So I'll just make up another piece. It's not a big deal to make these up, but I want to get a really nice fit on these. Remember, everything inside the cockpit you're going to see one way or another. This is how you can replicate parts, making little adjustments. Now sometimes you get it in 2 or 3 shots.
Sometimes you get it in 20, but either way, this actually acts as a bulkhead in the fuselage, so I don't want this to just be a part that goes along for the ride. I used a piece with nice straight grain. I want a nice tight fit around here, and I want to connect it with some rigidity to the carbon, because this is stiffening up this whole part of the fuselage. Spitfire actually has a pretty large canopy area. This is where it gets tricky, is I want to make sure I still have the clearance around here, and that piece falls into the rib between the back window and the front part of the Malcolm hood.
Now, in the course of doing this, being patient is just the key thing, because where that plexiglass is going to fit right up on that bulkhead, I want a perfect fit if I possibly can get it. And using the templates, going back and forth until they're perfect, is a key part of getting this to be the job I want. Now, I'm fast forwarding through some of this. I think you can get the idea how once you have the outer shape, it's that outer shape that's critical. Now, the middle piece of tape, this gives you the thickness that you want and allows you to get that trim on there nice, a little bit easier than eyeballing it. But making up all these pieces, critical stuff. So now this is where having the templates and we're having the pictures of what the inside of the cockpit really looks like. I try to replicate this piece with the lightning holes, make sure it fits in the plexiglass, seal everything with thin CA on the inside, and I want to put a finish on it, a very smooth finish, so I can actually, when I'm all done with this, I don't want to have to go back in with a paintbrush and paint it. It's easier to paint some of these things before you put them in place. All the final finishing, clean the edges up, chamfer all the holes just a little bit, and it looks like when it's all done, this is a very, very little detailed piece, and it's a very important part of that look that the ink marker can blacken up the inside of the holes, a key little part of the cockpit detailing. I never have done this before, is I put a little bit of this on a Q-tip to try to get a nice flat look like you would get in a shadow. Since this is supposed to, like in theory, be open, just took a little bit of ink in on the end of a Q-tip. And again, I may want to paint that, but for right now, a real Spitfire, the seat is different, there's no bracing inside, but I don't want to take a chance on having that canopy get squeezed. But I try to capture that look anyway. Anyway, the next thing I want to do is make up the simulated radio and put the flooring, the decking in there. Now the little radio in there and all the little spots at having these books, the Spitfire books, having some flat model paint and just being very careful. I'm working from the inside out, trying to detail this out, one step at a time. One of the things that I like to do, again, to create illusions, is simply get different textures into that cockpit area. In this case, what I'm doing, or what I'm going to try to do, never say doing, always say trying to do, is make the flooring out of the 600 sandpaper, which would simulate a dull kind of a surface. And again, I'll make up a little pattern here. What I try to do is just get different textures, different surfaces when the sun reflects in there. It doesn't look like it's all one big piece of balsa wood or whatever. Now here's where having a model that's already built and having the videos on how you built it comes in handy. I like the way the little radio looked that I put in the original Spitfire, and I liked it so much, in fact, I went back and I made kind of a replica of it, not exactly, of course. But what I want to do now from this is I want to cover this with some sheet aluminum, and I know that sounds like, like difficult, but just think, if you painted this, it'd be real difficult to get rid of the wood grain, and the aluminum really, really gives it a dimension that you wouldn't otherwise have. Now in this case, the stuff that I know worked last time, I have these surgical blades which you can buy in any Rite Aid store. I want to see if I can get this off in one piece.
and you really have to be careful, these are really sharp. But when you turn this package inside out, it has just the right shape of aluminum now. It's a really soft aluminum, so you can really put a burnish on it and everything. You want to get that blade out of there without destroying the package. And again, you know, we're not really trying to make some scale thing where the guy's going to come by and say, oh, the radio was different shape in the other plane. Well, what I want is something that when you look at it real quickly, it identifies that it is a radio. Well, see, this has the blade in there. But you don't want to cut yourself with one of them. Anyway, you almost have to destroy one part of this to get I guess I will just sacrifice half of it to get at that real soft aluminum. Now I know the real scale model is they have tricks within tricks within tricks for this stuff, but for our purposes this will do. And what I need to do is burnish this down. Just looking through my box of things, see, here's some blade covers for a surgical blade that have some little recesses in it. Again, I'm looking for more for ideas than anything else. Of some of these. These have smooth aluminum. This has a little texture. So I'm going to take a couple of these apart and just see what I can come up with for an idea. It's real. Of course, we don't want to eliminate good old aluminum foil either.
So once that's wrapped with aluminum and some little pinpoints to simulate riveting and a little CA, you can make a pretty realistic radio that's very super lightweight and very highly detailed and almost scale. I'm making an RF antenna, a little circular antenna with a wire bender, a little bit of black paint, and a little piece of aluminum tubing. And from looking at the book, the pictures came out pretty realistic. This was a nice little detail.
The next step is I want to lay out the sides that'll line the sides here before I attach anything permanently. I want all these pieces just to drop in, a drop fit. And I can do that while the epoxy's drying, holding that radio in. Further is paint the back of this so that the part that you're going to see, paint it the zinc chromate color. This way, once it can be drying while I'm working on these front pieces. Made up a floor pattern, and what I want to do is I put some contact cement on the back of it. As soon as it's sticky, I want to attach some 600 paper so that that'll be the floor. It'll look like an anti-grip panel for the floor. Biggest problem with putting a floor in, I don't want any interference with the arrow shaft. I'm just waiting for that the glue to kick off, and then I'm going to make up the sides.
And I'm working from the inside out, from the bottom to the top, and every time I add details or do anything, I go back and test fit that I don't have any interference on a push rod or the canopy. Now the same techniques, making the sides that you're going to see, make a little template up, make the part up, make the little riblets, cut the holes in with a tubing cutter, and look back at the documentation we have. Make it as realistic as possible, but it doesn't have to be scale. But the two little pieces that make the throttle quadrant from balsa wood, the throttle quadrant is something you'll see. And then painting everything with the paint before it gets installed. And to find a little detail, ink in some riveting, some semi-scale riveting. It's a lot easier to do it now before it's installed. Remember, the idea here is to work from the inside out, not to get all done and then have to put the floor in, as an example. Laying out the dashboard shape, and then we're going to do some final detailing. So from that piece, I can make the final dashboard shape, and in looking at the drawings, I can get a rough idea of what I want it to look like.
Start with P1, which is my pattern. And the first thing I want to do is I want to go get the book, try to find what I think will be a reasonable instrument layout, and get a look at just what some of the choices are in instrument layouts. Again, we can't make it really scale, but we can get that look of what it would tentatively look like. Now this picture here kind of gives you a rough idea of... Now see, again, real Spitfire. The dashboard is vertical and it's much further forward in the plane, so well, we're obviously not going to do it. And if you did this, when you in a stunt model, you wouldn't even see the dashboard. So again, we have to improvise a little. Here's a little drawing, and we did this yesterday. We made this wheel up. But just, you can see some of the cables that run inside, the lightning holes, some of the things we're trying to get a simulation on. Now it looks like, and we haven't made this little lever yet, it looks like this dashboard is just kind of a rounded thing I'm trying to lay out. And because this is an early model one, the instrumentation is totally different than the late model ones. Now this gives you a real good look at one row of instruments, the master switch, second row. It looks like they probably in the early ones had 3, maybe 4 rows of instruments. If we were a scale model, this would be real handy, but in fact in our case not going to do much good at all. Anyway, I can just basically get the idea of the rows of the instruments. Some of the most important, when I go to make the yoke up, I want to make that shovel handle yoke, but just a little look at this, just make it as prototypical as possible.
So even if you're not making a semi-scale model, having a dashboard with realistic instruments is one of the nice things. I cut it out of balsa wood, burned the holes in with a Dremel tool, a stone, not a cutter, glue that whole piece to a piece of sandpaper, 600 grit, 1000 grit, doesn't really matter, just so it looks dull. Now you could just rough the holes out with the pen and then go back in with the Dremel hole with the stone, make the edges perfect, outline them with a little ink marker. You got a 3-dimensional dashboard.
These little rhinestones, which make for great little lights. These, of course, for making, remember years ago people just put 50 of these in, and then after a while the knobs would fall off and pretty soon the cockpit looked more like a pin cushion. Don't know if I'm going to be able to use this, but this is cockpit combing, maybe for around the top of the dashboard. It's a good idea. There's another thing, is I have some pictures of, and of course I have the real planes here, so it makes it even easier. Some of the dashboards and some of the details that were on some of the other models, so you can get a little idea. Some of the lighting, the gun sight, some of the switches. So we got a lot of little things to work on, and it's good that this gets spread out over a couple of days, because the next thing I want to do is I want to lay out the instruments. I was in the middle of doing this the other day when the phone started ringing, and now it's just a question of I'll get out the books. One of the things I like to do, make sure the instruments are not upside down or on an angle or whatever. And if possible, if I can get some of them to actually be where the real instruments are. Keep in mind, it's not a scale model, so the shape of the fuselage is different. It's just not possible to make a totally scale dashboard. But to get the look we're after, I think we'll get pretty close. Now, a good way to get these in position, just hold them with the tip of a new XL blade. And I mean the smallest drop of, in this case, Brodax CA, the slightest drop will hold these right in position. Whoops, what I like to do is get the extra off so I don't have a big glob there. And of course, if it's wrong, I can just go over it with another instrument. Now, one of the ways, if you miss it, you can take a black pen and go around it. We're pretty much just going to go by and replace these instruments one by one now. One of the little improvements I found is the CA was kind of bleeding through on the instruments and making them a little fuzzy. So what I did, I took some carpenter's glue, obviously Elmer's glue, some kids' glue, even probably rubber cement would be okay. And that worked a lot better. It also gives you a split second to adjust the instruments. So a little improvement as we're going along here in instrumentville. Anyway, from this point on, this starts to really pick up speed. Okay, so now the next step is have a sheet of this thin, like canopy material to represent the glass. And what I want to try to do now, I want to mix up some 5-minute epoxy and just glue this in spots. I don't want to get any glue near the instruments, because if you squeeze it and it comes in together, boy does it make a mess. And then while that's drying, I want to very carefully position this on top. And when I'm all done, then I'll cut it out, of course, but really to get it as accurate as possible. With what the epoxy gives me a little chance to do is do this and get it all lined up just perfectly. Now the idea of this whole thing is when it's all done and you walk by the cockpit, you get that little flash of off the glass. That little flash. That's what I like about this. And then when it's dry, while it's drying, we can make up some of the other little detailing. Those old map pins, one of the things that makes it look a lot more realistic, if I get a piece of aluminum tubing here and make this, if you look at a real plane, a lot of them have a throttle that works in and out like this, so you can simulate that with a little piece of the smallest size of aluminum tubing that they make. Now that looks a little bit better, but the final thing is I want to get another little piece of tubing to make the sleeve that would normally be the throttle going in and out. At least on the air coupe that's how it was. The air coupe Spitfire. And it's just 2 pieces of telescoping tubing. Now I'll make a couple of these up for the various little controls. There's also a lever for the retractable gear. I can make that little lever up similar way with a pin and a little piece of aluminum tubing. You can take an ordinary T-pin here, just cut one side off and put a piece of tubing on one side. It makes a very nice simulated lever. Again, this is all good little things I can do while that dashboard, the epoxy is drying. By the time that's done, I'll have some of this detailing ready to go. Now you just need to take a parting wheel and put a little notch in a piece of tubing like this, and you got it. It's all set. Now you got another one of the little levers made. And that's where that little lever will reside, but I don't want to permanently epoxy him in there because I'm going to be working up here, so I'll just store him for later. Now I got some of this thin aluminum tubing. I want to see if it's even possible to replicate the bends in this yoke. It's almost like a shovel handle. You see, the problem with this is I can't really bend it that sharp. Maybe I got to make this out of wire. Well, let me practice with this. So I made this nice big bend, but that's too big in diameter. Enough tubing to keep K&S in business. Not happy. The tubing didn't bend, it kinked. Wasn't real happy with it. But so what I did, I took a bunch of scraps of 64th plywood, and I want to see if it's just possible. I remember when I made the carrier hook for the Seafire. It's just trying to get this shape here. It's a little more round. And we'll see if we can carve this out of a piece of plywood. This way the grain will be going in a lot of different directions. When in doubt, use 64th plywood. Let's see what that looks like. I'm trying to get the feel if I have the right shape here or not. Boy, if you ever want to see something that's delicate here, it's like I'm doing dental work or something. Anyway, even if this one doesn't work out, I have an idea how I can do this now. Laminates of 64th plywood with the grain going all different directions are real good for when you want to do a little tiny part like this. It is very delicate work though. My eyes are so bad I can hardly see this. Can't even hold it, let alone see it. But it's all these little details that ultimately when you're done, you're looking at, wow. Now I'll admit to making 70s, but I probably made 12. Anyway, What I have to do now is get a little dowel of sandpaper and hand finish this round. This is on a yoke where this in a real plane swivels back and forth, so I have to somehow simulate that joint either with paint or ink. Now it's probably that's the final one. I'm almost done for the night after carving this. Now see how this yoke, well, obviously it rotates here on a. Anyway, I'm going to hand finish it. This is about all I'm going to have time for today. This took a long time to do. This took a lot longer than just putting a toothpick there. Now I got a couple of coats of thin CA on here. Let it kick off normally. And I'll put a final finish on this and try to get some more of the detailing on that yoke. Remember that little thing of sandpaper on a toothpick? This is just a perfect spot for it right now to do some of the final detailing. Usually you need 2 or 3 coats of thin CA sanded between coats. Simulate this the shape. And after bending all that wire and seeing what paint that was, boy, this looks like the lesser of 2 evils ultimately. Leave it on that. That was a lot of carving and sanding. I want to get a couple coats of paint on this. That'll probably be all we're going to get done tonight, but that's about as close as simulation. Much closer to scale than a toothpick, say. Well, that's it for today. What I've been doing is storing all my little levers and things here. This took a lot longer than I thought it would. Everything on this plane is taking longer than I thought it would. Anyway, we'll pick this up tomorrow. Hey, today I'm looking at the little yoke. It dried up real nice. This is ready for doing the ink work. And what I want to do is I want to lay out all my little details that I've been making last couple of days. Just get a look at them. All these little throttles and everything, because I need to figure out exactly what I still want to do. Every time you start a new day, you almost have to hit the reset button a little bit, look at some of this, and figure out exactly what part of this I want to work on. Let me go look at that dashboard and see what's next. This is what I bought this at a little craft store. And these are little, I don't know if we're going to see these up on a macro lens, little jewels. And what I use these jewels for, this is on the Seafire, you can see right here and right here. They act like little lights. In fact, we have one up by the switches. So I think what I'm going to do today is first I'm going to make up some switches. Look at some of the other cockpits, just to get ideas from these. This one has jewels in it too. Those little details, I guess I'll work on this first so the epoxy can be dry and figure out where I want to have the lights. I need to drill a little hole or leave a little impression and then just put a drop of epoxy in there to drop these in place. There's a lot of different ways to drill holes here, but this is one way that just seems to be a doable way, and I don't want to make them any bigger than they have to be. See, I like the look of the glass reflecting, and because these are up high, these will sparkle when the light shines through them. Now, this really gets to be a lot harder than you think it is. So I want to get one tiny drop, just a little bit of epoxy down in that hole. Now what I want to do, I want to take a toothpick, just wet it just enough. Come on. I don't want to drop it in and then have to move it. I want to get it right on the first shot. If you can see, let's see if I can focus in on this. Because this is the only way I know of to get it. Yep. Sorry this is taking a minute, but this is one of the things that I know everybody just loves to see, those little jewels. extra ones I'll save in that envelope with all the dials and gauges and things that I have extra of. Okay, I put this one to throttle kind of on off things. Now that could be a throttle, it could be a primer. In a real airplane, the primer usually looks something similar to that. But anyway, again, when we're making a fantasy dashboard, we want to try to make it as realistic, but it doesn't have to be prototypical. One of the things I heard all kind of comments about was the switches. So I want to make them up. I'm going to make them up a similar way. I'll do real quick, go through it again for anybody that hasn't seen the Seafire videos. These little switches add a real nice touch to any model. Start with a bunch of old T-pins. Doesn't even matter if they're nice new ones. They can be old and junky. And what I want to do is take them over to the anvil and flatten one end off. So it's like a little bit of a spoon. What I do, and it's really, well, just cut off any length of pin, it doesn't matter, until you have, I want to still maintain a sharp edge, so I can hold this with needle nose pliers, just makes it a little bit easier. Let's get a focus on this. Next step is just try to file it as even as you can. Next step is just get an old block of balsa wood, and we don't need any particular kind. And I'm using a piece of that Teflon paper. And I need to get some real tiny washers. Now you really have to position a switch at this point in time where you'd like it to be, either down, neutral, or up. And of course I try to leave a little, just the right amount, get it straightened out. And I'll line up the whole slew of them here. You can see this up close what that looks like. Okay, now I need to mix up a little epoxy, put some black dye in it, and put a coating of black epoxy on these guys. And just one drop of dye in here, and that should give us what we want. Now I put this epoxy on with a toothpick. And again, what I'm looking for is it leaves a nice, if you luck out, I guess, it leaves a nice shiny, the kind of look that a real switch would have. Similar to a real switch anyway. And the idea of the Teflon paper is just in case a little doesn't get by. I want to get some on there, but I don't want to have a big glob. And it's always a good idea to, if you make 10 of these or 12 or whatever, and then make a few extra. And while you're all set up and fool around with this stuff, then the next time you need them, you'll either have them or you'll remember to do them. And usually when these dry up, and if you want to speed up the drying, you can just hit them with a hairdryer, of course. Put them by a heating vent. Tricks is just while it's last few minutes while the glue is still thin, hang it upside down so it tends to drip toward the end, and it gives that the look of a real switch when it dries. Just going to hold this here for a couple minutes. Now I'm just just wanted to show when it's all dried up and I've pressed them in. Of course you can make some of the switches up, some down if you want to be cute. Just one extra drop of epoxy with dye in it. It really does make the switch look like, well, what a World War II switch looks like. Now a good idea, little tip, is when you press these in, don't press them in with the little black edges. Grab it with a needle nose pliers just in front of the washer and press it in. And then what I did is I put a few drops of CA on the back, thin CA, just so obviously so they don't all fall apart. Now I'm starting with just an ordinary T-pin here, and what I want to do, I want to cut up a little piece of 64th plywood. I fill that in with thin CA because I want to make the little handle like we have on the emergency brake lever. Kind of looking at the drawings, that looks like it repeats itself over and over again. I want to fill in that little area in between with some thin balsa, hardened up with CA, and then carve that brake handle. Now I don't want to admit how much time I put into like making a little control handle here. I made up about 7 of these before I found one that I really liked. And most of this stuff is just patience and just copying things that are either from pictures, books. Library is a good source of books, videos. Now once I get a final finish on this, I gotta sand this down. I'll get it sanded. I'm gonna mix up some epoxy with red dye in it, because the real Spitfire, this handle is red. And this way, the epoxy leaves a final finish in one coat, unlike paint, where you'd see the grain and you'd have to paint it over and over again. And it leaves a texture that looks an awful lot like the plastic. I guess the handles were made out of plastic. I'm assuming they were. Oh boy, if you only knew how long this took to do. My fingers feel like raw meat working on this. Anyway, it has the little look of the emergency brake pull lever. I'm going to mix up the red epoxy now and see if I can make this look even a little more realistic. Now, I had to mix some red and yellow to get this color. I don't think this color is the right color. May have to paint this after I'm done, but this will certainly seal the wood grain. God, making up these little details, believe me, this takes a lot of time. It was very time consuming. But when it's all done and you're looking at little cockpit, now the trick is to hit this with a hairdryer, and that just thins it out and you get all the details back. All our little epoxy and knobs and switches and everything is drying. I only have about an hour left in this day, but I want to trace out. Now see, this is the piece I cut off of the nose, and it's already fiberglass that already has a nice bend in it. So what I want to try to do is lay out the shape of the seat and the bottom part of the seat and interconnect them, and use this as either a pattern, or if it comes out real nice, we can use this actually as part of the seat. That is the shape of the real seat. I mean, let's face it, it wasn't rolled and tucked and pleated, you know what I mean? Oh, I just roughly roughed this out by getting the height. Remember, in a real airplane, the seat would sit much lower in the plane, so you have to kind of fudge this. But this is kind of the shape, just roughly the shape, that you can see in all the books. And so if I just rough this out real quickly, and I can get a look at what this is going to look like. Now this is the curve I want to capture. I want to capture this, I don't know what you would call it. Now obviously the reason this is like this is so the pilot can look back. More visibility. The easiest way I know to make any symmetrical shape, and again I'm doing this by eye, I'm not doing this any real specific shape, but what I want to do is I certainly want to make it symmetrical. And I can take my whole template. This would give us the diameter for the headrest. You could pick some other diameter that you thought by roughing it out, because once I unfold this, it should be, in theory anyway, it should somehow have that close anyway. That's an easy way of just roughing a part out. Now you could make as many of these as you want, and I've been making multiples of every part I've made so far. Usually throwing a few away, keeping a few. Now I can go over to the plane before I trace this out and see if this is the shape, if this is going to look like the shape that I want. At least I know it's symmetrical. Now with the little pattern in there, I can get a rough idea, and I just want it to touch at the top. That would be scale, and it's got to rest on this subflooring, of course. So that's close to being. And the pilot obviously would. I don't know why I'm worrying about this. The pilot can't even see the handle. Look right on it. But anyway, it's always nice to try to make it as prototypical as possible. If we're real lucky, we'll get the bottom piece of the seat out of the same piece of wood, and it'll also have a similar curve in it. Now I can use the same pattern and just get a little bit of an idea. It's a lot easier to do it with a piece of paper. Now, of course, this will have a curve in it. Okay, so wherever I have that little piece of wood that's left over, it's just going to make it. I didn't plan it this way, by the way. I know nobody will believe that, though. But if in doubt, when you're doing a little project like this, always make the parts a little bit oversized. You can always trim them down. Let's see what it'll be when this part gets connected over this lost half of the seat here. When this gets connected, I'm going to have to obviously put this curve in. I used the original part. It just wound up being too short, so I just took some thin wood to make this piece. Because what I want to do is I want to finish this seat and maybe get the paint on it tonight, so that tomorrow I can install these parts. That'll be the end of these. Now what I wanted to do also, I wanted to put a little triangular brace in here. That's pretty prototypical of warbirds of that era. And I want to put that the headrest piece up here. I want to lay this out. Piece of 64th plywood. Now I need to have a way of holding this while I put a coat of that flat aircraft, I don't know what we'd call it, flat paint, but I'm not going to do it in the same color as the zinc chromate. I want to do it just one color different. That's why I bought 3 different shades of it. This way the seat will kind of stand out. It won't look like it's just the same thing. And we have these 2 colors. Who knows what this is? Interior green. Okay, let's try interior green. Now that's probably all I'm going to have time for tonight, but at least I got this ready to dry. And I'll carve that little head piece out, and I can let the paint on that dry. Then tomorrow I hopefully can assemble all this, get this whole cockpit put together. There's been a lot of time doing this. A lot of hours. Now just final sand this out to as, I guess, as scale a shape as I can and get a coat of flat black on it. Now today the little seat dried up real nice, and I just want to get a feeling for, I want to put all of this together for a split second. Just get an idea that if everything is going to fit the way I expect it will. Never fits the way you expect it will. Now it's almost like right now we're arranging little dollhouse furniture type of things. Now see, this color green is just a little bit different. There's that dashboard. And I can get a little look at. And this is what I do constantly, is just do a little mock-up to see if everything kind of fits. Looks a little bit different than when we first started. It's starting to look like I had envisioned anyway. And our little brake lever, the epoxy dried. Doing this with dyed epoxy is really a nice way to get a nice finish on it. It's almost impossible to get nice finishes on these little parts. This is a good little tip though. That little lever in there, that kind of worked out the way I wanted to. One more little detail I want to make of it. One of the tricks is there's not much better material that I know of than 64th plywood when it's laminated. And what I want to do is I want to make a little schematic of the shape that I want, oversize, and then I want to cut out 4 or 5 laminations, cross the grain, and that gives you a nice material to work in little details with. It needs almost no pre-finishing, usually works well right away. Most important thing when laminating up little scraps of plywood, you want the grain going, again, I keep saying it over and over again, but now I have a piece that I can take over to the grindstone, the Dremel tool, I can cut, shape, file, and it's for all purposes pre-finished. Once I sand it down, it'll just need a coat of paint and it's ready to go. And these old Bud McKnight sanding sticks seem to make a handy way. I cut that groove in with a little parting wheel. And this, of course, is trying to simulate a little quadrant type of control you would find on a World War II plane. The thing I want to do is epoxy that little headrest on the seat, and I can start laying out just exactly how I want to get the seat mounted into the cockpit itself. Now the reason I like to use drops of epoxy, because once we seal this up we can never go back in and get it out again, and epoxy seems to hold well to the paint. All that epoxy is drying, I can do a little ink detailing, do some riveting on the yoke and some of the other little parts. I'm going to start to do a line of riveting right around the edge here. Just try to get a little more prototypical if I can.
Now, putting the pieces together, putting a little ink in, white ink, black ink, the little jewels, the little handles, there's an endless amount of time you can spend doing this. And in my case, I'm a pretty devoted modeler, and I try to do my best, try to make it even a little cockpit combing, but I'm always working off the book, always working off some little picture of what the real part should look like.
Again, I got that waiting to dry, and now what I want to do is get the inside. Remember, this is on the inside, but I want to leave the glue area all around the edge where it's going to get glued. So I got to kind of go back and forth and see where this is going to get glued. The idea is to get it so when you look into the cockpit, anything that you would still see in these ribs and things, that it's painted on the inside. You wouldn't see the filler or the paint that goes on the outside. So I want to make sure I keep that edge that I'll see from the outside. It's easy just to do this by hand. I left just enough around the edge where I can catch the epoxy without catching paint. Now what I'm trying to do is line up that I've covered all the areas that I normally would see once this is glued in.
Another little detail I carved from balsa and put the little ridges in. It's the seat cushion that goes onto the aluminum seat. This is a pretty close to being prototypical seat cushion. And of course, every little detail just makes it a little more interesting. Now, more little details every time I'd look at the drawings. The aileron pedals, and I try to make them as scale as possible. The ink riveting on the inside of the canopy. There's details on this plane and on all the Spitfires you don't see until you look at these. If I take one of the planes down off the wall and you look at it close, sometimes people don't see it from far away. You certainly don't see it at the flying field. But if you look at it close, a lot of people are truly blown away. Now, it's a constant going back and forth, looking at it from every possible angle, and then looking at the book, what else can I add? What else can I add? And I'm really almost never satisfied. Now, I'm filling the ditch, the little ditch that I made to sink the canopy in. And by the way, thank you, Dave Midgley, for making these canopies. We have a separate video available of Dave making the canopies. He's made them for many of the models. This one absolutely was a perfect fit.
The more pins I can put around it while the epoxy is drying, it pushes in little rivets of little like nails around the edge. So I've got as many as I can around there. Gonna let that just sit for the next half an hour or so, 45 minutes. Once that epoxy hardens up, then I can take the pins out. But it's getting near the end of the day, and actually what I want to do, just babysit this for a half hour, come back and work on this tomorrow. Letting it dry overnight's a good investment. Now I let all the epoxy dry overnight, and today what I'm going to do, I'm going to real carefully pull out the pins.
At 3 o'clock, I'll be featuring my group of the week. This week's group will be the Chantel.
I'm looking for any spot here, any spot where this is leaking. I want to mix up a drop of 5-minute epoxy and fill a crack, or back here if there's any spot. And boy, I just kept putting pins in and nailing that sucker. You can move the whole plane by the canopy. Because I know the reality is this really does take a beating in time. Anyway, the next step then would be once this, and I see there's a little air space here. There's a couple little spots where I want this to be sealed, because once I start sanding it, I don't want any of the dust getting inside. And then I'll also have to mask off all the areas that'll remain clear before I start sanding on this. I don't know how much of this we're going to do. We're kind of near the end of the tape, but we'll try to get this roughly sanded in anyway today. Get some Brodak primer on it. And then pretty much we're going to be ready to finish the paint work on the plane. And that's something I'm really looking forward to. We're only a month away from flying season, and I want to get going on this. Little things that you may think you don't even have to, it's not even a factor, is pulling the pins out. What I've seen a lot of guys do is they grab the pin with a pair of pliers and take out a chunk of wood or distort the canopy. What I try to do, what's especially nice is these pins that John Pothier sent. They have a little like a handle on them, or the T-pins, where you can, and I just was using up old pins here, so I have some of each, is twist the pin a little bit as you pull it out and kind of unscrew it. And the reason is you don't put a strain on. That wood is kind of thin there. The canopy obviously is thin. Now what happens is everywhere there was a pin, there's a little tiny hole. And what I'm going to do when I take the epoxy, I'm going to heat up some epoxy and just put one little drop down in each one of the holes with a toothpick. And what that does, it acts like little rivets or little staples to even make it stronger. And even though that may seem it may seem like, yeah, wow, that's overkill, my canopy never fell off before. What happens is, what I'm looking for here is a plane that, like some of the planes we've been lucky enough to have 10, 15 years. I think we've got one 17 years old too, still flying. But as the planes get older and older, this is one of the areas that it'll start warping, and you may be subject to having some bubbles or something. And I think just having that rigid there, it also, it's just one of the things that I'd like to maintain. After all that work we did on the canopy, I just hate to see this side of the fuselage warp out or something crazy like that. This is now like a little focal point of the plane, and if we're lucky enough, it'll last in the entire life of the plane without the seat coming loose or without who knows what. In model aviation, everything's a surprise, but that we don't have something that we normally wouldn't have to deal with there. I'm going to take the rest of these pins out and see if I can get these little holes filled in, and maybe I'll even try using a pin and just putting a drop of epoxy down in each hole.
Now, two things that are very important is to keep that fit and finish, that we don't have any blisters, any paint peeling up, any loose material. It's a lot of overkill to do it this way, but boy, in the end, it actually becomes part of the fuselage. Getting it back masked, and that's going to allow me to get out the sanding polywogs and all the little sanding tools I have and blend that in so that you cannot feel where the canopy ends and where the wood begins.
Trying to get in these corners, and again, you look at all of the shapes. You know, I bought that Porter cable, that little sander, thinking, yeah, that'd be a great tool, and it's been a great tool. But these little sanding shapes, wow. And I know you can buy these separately at Home Depot if you don't want to buy the tool. Probably for $1 or $2 a piece. Because they're hard rubber, they really let you get in corners and angles, especially in an area like this where I want to get a perfect blend, and I need maybe 10 different shapes to get in here to really do it right. Now, one of the reasons Midgley molds these canopies out of a little thicker than normal material, normally like a SIG canopy is probably 10 thousandths thinner, but when I'm done with it, it gives me some material to blend in. And I really like having that little bit of extra material. And the only part of it that's not going to get thinned out and sanded is the glass, and that, to me, it doesn't mean anything, the few grains that are up there. Having that durability. And if you've ever seen canopies that in time they distort or from being out in the sun.
Now, it took over 2 weeks of shop time to shoot this video. I am really happy the way this came out, the way all the Spitfires came out. They all have incredible detail, including the Seafire that has the sliding canopy detail. Those videos are all somewhere out on the channel. But anyway, I hope you did enjoy this and give you some inspiration to do a nice cockpit detail on any of your models. I can only show the way it's worked for me over the years. It's added to my enjoyment of modeling. I know Joe Adamusco has done similar things with his Spitfires. We've shared the information as well as we can, as well as all of the information around the modeling that we have done over the years. Special thanks to Ray Dory for donating the footage that has made a lot of these videos that we're posting on YouTube possible. Thank you to John Pathia for his help over the years for all of the things that he's done. And to Dave Midgley, of course, thank you. I made the canopy mold. We may post that video soon. And for Dave that actually physically molded the canopies, he did a wonderful job. I hope you did enjoy the video. Please share it with your friends. And thank you guys one and all. Thanks so much for watching.